So welcome, we're going to take a look at chapter 13 on decision making. This is a very relevant chapter, has to do with how humans are sometimes limited in their decision making capabilities, and a very important application of this is how we make decisions about health. For the whole chapter, we're looking at first the issue of whether it's better to think carefully about something or just sort of sleep on it. And then we will turn our attention to heuristics. The first heuristic we're going to be looking at is the representativeness heuristic, and that has to do with basically how we ignore numerical information about the likelihood of an event and instead essentially use a stereotype. So we'll be looking at that. And then in other videos, we'll be looking at availability and anchoring, and then just kind of the issue of, are we rational decision makers? So first off, unconsciously weighing options. So is it better to dedicate time, weigh pros and cons, do it all very rationally, or should you set it aside, go about your life, sleep on it, and then kind of go with your gut? To study this, researchers divided the participants up into three groups. They had a group 1 that had to make an immediate decision, group 2 that had to think about it for a few minutes and kind of focus their attention on it, and then a third group that had the delay. This was the group that was supposed to be doing like sort of the unconscious decision making. They were prevented from consciously thinking about the decision because they were told to do something that was going to interfere with it. Now, what was the decision? They had to do something that probably a lot of us have had to consider, which is, where are we going to live? So they had to consider what's the best apartment to move to out of a number of different choices. So out of the different factors that you might consider in, which apartment you're going to rent, deciding which apartment you're going to rent, you're probably going to include, the price, how much it costs every month, are utilities included? And location is probably super important. Is it close to school, close to work, those kinds of things? Is the neighborhood safe? Probably if you have a pet, that's going to be a big, consideration. Does it have a washer and dryer, or do you have to go to a laundromat? And of course, the size of the apartment and, just more or less how nice it is. So all of these factors are probably important, but some of them are probably more important than others. So for example, if we look at price, I would think that one is super important, right? If you have an apartment, you find an apartment that has great location, nice neighborhood, it allows pets, has a washer and dryer available, nice and roomy, and is super nice, but you can't afford it, what's the point, right? So that's sort of a really high priority thing. However, maybe for you, size is less important than the other factors. And maybe you're also flexible on location. So I'm going to put little down arrows on next to those, because those perhaps for you are not anywhere near as important. Maybe utilities included is also one that's not super important to you. However, price might be really critically important. And if you have a pet, that could be really critically important. And then other things are more neutral, like really nice to have. You're going to weigh them as moderately important. If we think about how we might make that kind of a decision, we have to do something called weighting, right? We have to weigh those different options, price, pets, washer and dryer, differently, depending on how critical each of those factors is to us. And so these three groups that we see here in the study, the group that had to make the immediate decision versus the group that did rational thinking for a few minutes, and the group that did the unconscious decision because they were distracted and just then went with their gut, so to speak, we can see then that really what this is testing to see is under which of these three conditions can you weigh the importance of a number of different factors better. The results found that the unconscious group, that this one right here, was the one that did the best, and the researchers then concluded that unconsciously weighing options is superior to actively thinking about it and weighing those pros and cons. And so that led to something called unconscious thought theory. And unconscious thought theory has to do with the idea that there are certain tasks that we do better unconsciously versus consciously versus, deliberately thinking about it. The reason for it is, it's actually not as kooky as it seems, because the reason for it has to do with the capacity. So if we remember, working memory, short-term memory, has that limited capacity. Well, if you're processing things in a more automatic way and in this unconscious way, it doesn't really require, you're not using short-term memory, so you are not limited by the limited capacity of short-term memory. So that's a really important thing. So remember, with the apartment, there were lots of different factors involved, and so the limited capacity of short-term memory is going to be a hindrance. And if we can then solve these types of problems that require us to weigh a lot of different factors at once without short-term memory, that would kind of be, pretty neat. And so that's the idea, that we are able to do this unconsciously. And they also say that especially when you're weighing evidence, that some things are more important than others, and you have to assign a weight of importance to different factors or different types of evidence, that unconscious thought does this sort of naturally and intuitively for us. Problem with unconscious thought theory is that although it does make a lot of sense, and although it is a very interesting theory, it does not seem to have all of that much empirical support. This research paper on unconscious thought theory has tried to replicate the study done by the researchers, and they found that they were not able to replicate the study at all. So they did 4 different experiments that tried to test unconscious thought. They used the same procedures as the original researchers, but they were unable to replicate that study. So I bring this up just to point out that some things in this class that we're going to talk about have a lot of empirical support, and they're theories that have a lot of support for them, that we can be fairly confident are going to be explaining things accurately. There are other theories that are maybe a little bit newer. Just because they're in the textbook doesn't necessarily mean they have that same level of empirical support, and that's where this falls. It's not at that level of some of the other things that we've talked about. So certainly when we talk about short-term memory and the limitations of it and how it works and how we store things in long-term memory and all of that stuff, there's a lot of empirical support for that. There's really no serious questioning that the basics of those are pretty well described. But something like this, like unconscious thought theory, it's a cool theory, it's very interesting, it meshes with our understanding of the limitations of short-term memory, but it just doesn't have the same level of empirical support.